The story of aviation is quite simply one of the most fascinating chapters in the entire history of human civilization. Man taking successfully to the skies and being able to cover vast distances was thought impossible for almost the whole of human history until flying burst triumphantly onto the world stage little more than 100 years ago. It then developed at extraordinary speed, from bizarre and dangerous contraptions that could barely get off the ground to reliable international travel within just a few short decades. Join me in this compelling story of heroism, genius, trial, tragedy, and glory. It's the story of a stunning victory by human ingenuity and endeavor over the force of gravity, something many thought could never be conquered. And since its inception, it has completely transformed the world we live in. Hello, and welcome to The Shape of Now with me, Basil Valentine, where we explore why the world is the way it is. In this video, we trace the birth of flight and ask how it all began. What were the key breakthroughs and who made them? How did ordinary people react to sights they never thought possible? The story of air travel starts in a world when journeys were very slow, and it ends with airport security and departure boards flicking through cities and continents. Before air travel, it was extremely rare for people to travel long distances, and indeed in many parts of the world it still is. There was only one way to cross the oceans, and that was by boat. The world was spacious and slow, and most local people were confined to the area where they lived. The invention of steamships and railways were both huge leaps forward, but the world still felt very large, with journeys often perilous and leaving marks on travellers' minds and bodies, and that's if you made it at all. Timetabled railway and ocean liner services created more predictable long-distance travel and offered a glimpse of the organisation that underpins modern aviation. But long journeys were still arduous, requiring particularly detailed planning. So let's rewind and look at when and where it all began. And that means going all the way back to China in the 5th century BCE, because the very first man-made objects to achieve sustained flight were the kites that the Chinese used in religious ceremonies. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and the luminary Leonardo da Vinci sketched numerous designs for flying machines. His drawings showed that for the first time ever, on paper at least, the potential for creating complex mechanical ways to fly. But Da Vinci was simply years ahead of his time, and the mechanisms could not be built with the technology of his day. It wasn't until the Enlightenment of the 18th century unleashed a feverish fascination with science and mechanics, particularly with the mysterious physics of gases lighter than air, that a key breakthrough came. No year burned brighter with this new aeronautical mania than 1783, the year humanity first rose from the earth in balloons. The first great leap came from the Montgolfier brothers, Joseph Michel and Jacques Etienne, papermakers whose experiments with hot air have become the stuff of legend. On June the 4th, before an astonished crowd, their hot air balloon soared to roughly 3,000 feet, a shimmering, impossible globe rising above the French countryside, and one that ignited a continent-wide craze. Just weeks later, Paris witnessed another marvel. An unmanned hydrogen balloon launched from the spot where the Eiffel Tower now stands and drifted gracefully across the countryside, descending near the village of Gonesse, where its beauty turned into panic. Local people were convinced that this silk apparition was a supernatural threat and attacked it with knives and pitchforks, shredding the creation into ribbons, something that spawned the tradition of post-flight champagne. The dragon-like hot air balloons floating across the skies often terrified the people on the ground. So to prove that they were human and not demons, and to compensate for crushed crops, the aristocratic balloonists began carrying bottles of champagne to share with the landowners where they landed, a tradition that continues to this day. Next, on that great year, September the 19th, at Versailles, before the ill-fated King Louis XVI, the Montgolfiers launched another hot air balloon. At that time, it wasn't considered safe for human beings to take to the air, but this one did bear the first living aeronauts in history: a duck, a rooster, and a sheep. The sheep was rewarded with a place in Marie Antoinette's menagerie, but crucially, the animal's survival proved that living creatures could survive a trip into the sky. And so the first human being to leave the ground, though still tethered by a rope, was Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier on October the 15th. Suspended above Paris, his bravery electrified the city. And then, finally, on November the 21st, came the moment that transformed human history. At the Château de la Muette, daredevils Pilatre de Rosier and the Marquis d'Orlandre climbed into a Montgolfier hot air balloon and launched the first untethered manned flight. For 25 minutes, they drifted over Paris, covering 5.5 miles, about 9 kilometers, and immense crowds erupted in cheers of sheer wonder. This was Balloonomania. Prince of the aeronauts and their flying machines flooded Europe. Balloon-themed hairstyles, wallpaper, jewellery, clocks, chairs, chandeliers, even hats appeared everywhere. If people could fly, what else might they conquer? As one observer of the time marvelled, among all our circle of friends at all our meals, in the antechambers of our lovely women, as in the academic schools, all one hears is talk of experiments, atmospheric air, inflammable gas, flying cars, and journeys in the sky. Prescient words indeed. The Balloonomania frenzy reached a crescendo on December the 1st, when 4 noblemen ceremoniously carried a balloon built by Nicolas Louis Robert in procession through Paris. Benjamin Franklin himself was among the throng in the crowd as Jacques Charles and Nicolas Louis ascended from the Tuileries in the first manned hydrogen balloon. The spectacle was outrageous. Contemporary artists depicted wild crowds gawping in amazement. As the balloon rose, Jacques Charles was simply overwhelmed. As quoted in Richard Holmes' Falling Upwards, he wrote, "Nothing will ever quite equal that moment of total hilarity that filled my body at the moment of takeoff. I felt we were flying away from the earth and all its troubles and persecutions forever. It was not mere delight, it was a sort of physical rapture. I explained to my companion, Monsieur Robert, I'm finished with the earth. From now on, our place is in the sky." By the end of 1783, Europe had witnessed sheep and roosters sail through the heavens, hydrogen phantoms shredded by pitchforks in the hands of angry peasants, aristocrats fainting with excitement, and scientists declaring allegiance to the sky itself. Humanity had taken flight, and there was simply no turning back. Just 16 years later, a huge breakthrough was made by the man who came to be known as the father of aviation, although he never flew himself, and his name is far less well known than it should be. In 1799, Sir George Cayley outlined the concept of the modern aeroplane as a fixed-wing flying machine with separate systems for lift, propulsion, and control, and modern aeroplane design is based on those discoveries and the cambered wings he proposed. Crucially, Cayley discovered the 4 forces of flight: lift, weight, thrust, and drag, 100 years before the Wright brothers took to the air. But Cayley himself was too old and perhaps too wealthy to risk his own neck in any airborne contraption, so instead he forced his reluctant coachman to become the pilot of his full-sized glider. On landing after a short spin in 1853, the coachman resigned on the spot. "I was hired to drive, not to fly," he said. Meanwhile, in France in 1852, Henri Graffard, an engineer, went 27 kilometers in his steam-powered dirigible airship. It looked like something from a steampunk fantasy film, a craft featuring an elongated hydrogen envelope tapering to a point at each end, from which was suspended a long beam with a triangular sail-like rudder, and beneath the beam a platform for the pilot, the steam engine, and the propeller. Crucially, Giffard had demonstrated that you could fly and steer at the same time, and when he completed the first powered, steerable flight in 1852, the public reaction echoed the balloonomania of decades earlier: astonishment, disbelief, and a kind of jubilant fear that humanity had once again leapt into a new age. Parisians who witnessed Giffard's great cigar-shaped airship humming overhead described it as a mechanical fish gliding through the sky, impossibly controlled by a man at the helm. Crowds spilled onto the streets, craning their necks upwards, some cheering wildly, others crossing themselves or fleeing indoors. Newspapers proclaimed that Giffard had forced the air to obey, and for a moment it seemed the dream of true aerial navigation, of ships sailing the sky as predictably as those at sea, had finally arrived. The public and scientific communities celebrated the achievement as a monumental leap towards practical air navigation, which it was, despite its operational limitations. It was an extraordinary sight, and the ongoing industrial revolution of the 1800s saw innumerable more attempts at harnessing the newly invented power of steam to aviation, with various bizarre gravity-defying contraptions, most of which were doomed, sometimes tragically, to failure. But amongst the cranks, hopeful and just plain deluded, there were people making real progress in the emergent science of aerodynamics. And the key breakthrough came with a man called Otto Lilienthal, a German pioneer of aviation who became known as the Flying Man. Lilienthal built on George Cayley's pioneering work, and his great achievement was that he made the idea of heavier than aircraft a reality, making well-documented, repeated, successful flights with gliders. Otto Lilienthal's glider flights electrified the public and captivated scientists. Austrian physicist Ernst Mach praised Lilienthal's systematic approach. "Lilienthal's experiments are of the highest value," he said. "He has made the conquest of the air a matter of method and measurement." Crowds gathered to watch Lilienthal's controlled descents, seeing him as proof that human flight was indeed achievable. The German newspaper Vossische Zeitung wrote, "After witnessing a glide, Lilienthal throws himself into the air with the calm confidence of a man who has mastered a new element. The spectators cannot suppress their cries of excitement." Lilienthal subsequently made over 2,000 successful glider flights between 1891 and 1895, proving that human flight was indeed achievable and focusing on control. Engineers praised his data as the foundation for the nascent science of aeronautics in the decades that followed. But tragically, in 1896, Lilienthal died when a glider stalled and then crashed. His prophetic last words, "Opfer müssen gebracht werden," sacrifices must be made, are inscribed on his tombstone. After Lilienthal's death in 1896, the dream of human flight teetered between promise and peril. Many saw his fatal crash as proof that men were never meant to master the air. One New York newspaper captured the prevailing cynicism when it declared, "The flying machine which will really fly might be evolved by the combined and continuous efforts of mathematicians and mechanicians in from 1 million to 10 million years' time." William Thomson, also known as Lord Kelvin, was an outstanding British mathematician, instrumental in the formulation of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. But he insisted around the same time, flight by machines heavier than air is impractical and insignificant, if not utterly impossible. It just shows that even a genius can be wrong. And the engineer-in-chief of the US Navy, George Melville, wrote in 1901 that heavier-than-air flying machines were essentially a vain fantasy, implying that the engineers were wasting their time. But where others saw futility and tragedy, two brothers from Ohio, Orville and Wilbur Wright, saw unfinished science. They could see that the crucial missing piece in the flying jigsaw was control. Balloons rose, gliders drifted, but nothing yet allowed a pilot to truly command the air. So they studied birds, sketched endlessly, and in 1899 devised their breakthrough idea, wing warping. The concept was elegant. The wings of the craft would twist like a bird in flight, enabling the pilot to bank and turn. But the brothers needed data. At first, they used Lilienthal's experiments, but then they built a small wind tunnel in the bicycle shop where they worked, the best aerodynamic laboratory in the world at the time. Hundreds of hand-cut wooden airfoils passed through its blasting currents. Their measurements overturned decades of faulty figures. Suddenly, aviation had real numbers, and armed with the new data, the Wrights travelled to Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, where the winds were strong and the sand soft and forgiving. Over the next couple of years, they tested glider after glider, each one a refinement of Lilienthal's legacy. But steadier, more responsive, and crucially, more controllable offerings meant they were ready by 1903 for the next step, power. All the available engines of the time were too heavy, too weak, or too unreliable to lift a machine into the air. So, of course, they built their own, a homemade four-cylinder gasoline engine maintained with the help of their mechanic, Charlie Taylor. It produced 12 horsepower at an astonishingly light weight. And it wasn't just good, it was a miracle of efficiency for its era. Without it, the airplane would have stayed on the drawing board forever. And so on December the 17th, 1903, the Wright Flyer lifted from the sands of Kitty Hawk and into history. Orville made the first flight, 12 seconds and 120 feet. Wilbur's final flight of the day lasted nearly a minute. No balloon, glider, or dirigible in history had ever achieved true powered controlled flight. Yet most newspapers either ignored it or, as one Ohio journalist wrote skeptically, we don't really care about this. The Wrights were unfazed and kept refining their machine, while many still doubted. Those who visited Dayton and saw the flyer circle overhead left transformed. And in 1905, the Wright brothers achieved what even Lilienthal had never approached, a fully controllable, practical aircraft capable of extended flight. Now, before we award all the plaudits to the Wright brothers, we must also give honourable mention to one Alberto Santos Dumont, whose bizarre-looking 14 bis was the first officially recognised powered flight on the European continent. And while the Wright brothers' first flights were observed by only a tiny handful of people, Santos Dumont flew in front of large crowds in Paris. Debates persist to this day, with Brazilians hailing Dumont due to his public flights and control demonstrations, contrasting with the Wrights' more secretive early work. Moreover, the Wrights had mastered control over all three axes, pitch, roll, and yaw, which are crucial for practical flight, a feature some claim was lacking in Dumont's early designs. Newspapers of the time highlighted how the Wrights' success in America dwarfed Santos Dumont's dirigible work, showing their awareness and perceived superiority in actual airplane control. And so in 1908, the Wright brothers took the Kitty Hawk, as it became known, to Europe, arriving at the training field at Unaudière near Le Mans in France. Aviation enthusiasts were curious and fascinated, many politicians and scientists openly skeptical. But the moment Wilbur lifted the Wright Flyer into the air, banking gracefully, circling with precision, and landing softly, the crowd erupted. The French newspaper Le Figaro wrote, "It was not a flight, it was mastery." Another reporter described the stunned silence that followed Wilbur's first flight turn. The spectators gasped as one. This was not a machine, it was a will carried upon the wind. Former cynics were forced to recant overnight, and the great French aviator Louis Blériot admitted, "We are beaten, the Wright brothers have shown us the way." Suddenly, Europe declared the Wrights geniuses, which indeed they were, and crowds mobbed Wilbur wherever he went. Dignitaries lined up for rides in the flying machine. Their demonstrations in France transformed aviation from curiosity to inevitability. And so the dream that Lilienthal and others had died for of controlled, heavier-than-air flight was finally realized. The Wrights had not simply continued his work, they had refined it, completed it, and then carried it soaring above the fields of France, where the world at last looked up, gasped, and believed. Join me in part 2 of this fascinating series, when we'll be looking at how powered flight developed at breakneck speed, from the Wright brothers in 1908 and their demonstrations to commercial flight just 6 years later, and then within a few short decades on to the jet age and the golden age of air travel. Until then, I'm Basil Valentine. Please do feel free to comment about this extraordinary story, like and subscribe, and I'll see you all again very soon.